All right, we are chapter 4, behavior and attitudes. Questions that guide the discussion this week for this chapter. How well do our attitudes predict our behavior? When does our behavior affect our attitudes? And why does our behavior affect our attitudes? You would have heard me reference this from our first class, but how much do we act in a way that is predictable based on our attitudes? So, at one point, social psychologists felt that to know someone's attitude meant that you were able to predict their actions. Our attitudes, as seen here on the screen, are the beliefs and feelings that we have related to a person or an event. In the Bahamas, we reference and so if I say, quote, having an attitude, end quote, quote unquote, having an attitude, meaning that someone is upset or unhappy or showing that in a way that they relate. Example, she's given me attitude, meaning that the person is being mean towards you. But attitudes are not the action in the way that we use it, although our attitudes are related to our actions. So if we look at the studies that the text highlights very quickly, people's expressed attitudes hardly predicted their varying behaviors. And I wanted to point out here, expressed attitudes being that thing that you actually admit that you believe. So expressed attitude, I like fish. Expressed attitude, I believe in Jesus. Expressed attitude, I respect humans. So student attitudes toward cheating bore little relation to the likelihood of their own cheating. Attitudes toward the church were only modestly linked with weekly worship attendance. And self-described racial attitudes provided little cue to behaviors in actual situations. So here, this figure gives you just something quick to remember. You can remember the three dimensions of attitudes as the ABCs, where A is affect, which is your feelings, B, behavior, your behavior tendency, and C, cognition, which are your thoughts. And a version of the example the text gives are beliefs, which is our cognition about a group, is that they are taking all of our resources. So they are here in the country taking all of our resources. We then have feelings of disdain about them, which would now look at our affect. And as such, we act meanly toward them, our behavior. So you see the colored lines. In that instance, we went from the cognition to the affect to the behavior. But there is an intersection and an interaction at different levels with all three. So the challenge here is that we can't actually measure attitudes. Work has been done to capture our implicit attitudes, and we will talk about that in the next slides, but really all we can gauge is expressed attitudes, and as such, our behaviors are subject to outside influences. Remember the rule for this? Not for this course? Yeah, it depends. Well, here it is the same. There are three conditions when our attitudes do actually predict behavior, and we will break this down over the next slides. The three instances are when external influences are minimal, when attitude is specific to the behavior, and when attitude is potent. These are the three times that researchers found attitudes actually predict behavior. Okay, so the first one again, when attitudes predict behaviors, when social influences are not as pressing. When social influences are heavy, as we see that occurs when we are in groups, then behavior is more likely to be predicted by what others are doing and saying more than our own attitudes. So when we look at attitudes predicting behavior, we must look at the implicit behaviors, implicit attitudes. These are the unconscious attitudes as compared to our explicit and conscious attitudes. We measure implicit attitudes with the IAT, and we'll do that for this class here. So go on over, use the link on the course website, and go ahead and complete 3 of the IATs based on the information on the site. And we'll discuss them in class. So the IAT is a computer assessment that helps to measure reaction time to see how we associate concepts. So I won't even, I think if I try to explain it, I'm going to prime you a little bit. So let me just leave that right there. Now, IAT is always fun. And what we've learned from the millions of IAT assessments completed over the past 2 decades is that implicit biases are pervasive, which means we see them everywhere. But there are differences in the rates amongst people. Our text talks about group memberships, conscious attitudes, and immediate environments, helping to understand why there is a difference in the rates of these implicit attitudes amongst people. And finally, most of us are really unaware of the implicit biases. That's why they're called implicit. We'd like to think we are a certain way, but we can generally see from those automatic reactions. And going back to last chapter or chapter before when we were talking about, those responses we have that just occur without us even being able to think about it. Well, some of that is based off of our implicit attitudes. And so whether it is public or private, most of us will not admit to being prejudiced or racist, but sometimes taking these tests can show or suggest otherwise. So when attitudes predict behavior, again, the second is when we are measuring attitude that is directly connected or specific to the behavior. The example from the text is we do not predict people's involvement in exercise programs by assessing their attitudes toward health fitness. That's too broad. We would need to narrow down the attitude to the behavior that we are seeking to measure. So it's a different matter to assess people's attitudes about jogging benefits to predict their behavior of how often they jog. And we will look at the theory of planned behavior in some detail in a bit. All right, so the theory of planned behavior, Acheson is one of the lead researchers in this and showed that attitudes, perceived social norms, and feeling of control together determined our intentions, which these intentions are then thought to or have been shown to guide behavior. Now, when we break down the attitude, the perceived social norms, and the feelings of control, we should be looking at something that's very specific, just like going back to that example that we did, that the text uses with the attitudes toward jogging versus looking and measuring attitudes toward health. Same would be, don't ask people about their beliefs towards Christianity, or if they, identify as a Christian, you want to, if you are trying to get an understanding of, for example, church attendance, and you would want to ask them questions about their beliefs related to the importance of the value of attending church more than whether or not they identify as Christian or religious or something along those lines. Now, your text breaks down TPB, Theory of Planned Behavior, in great detail. So we understand attitude because this is what we're going over now. The other one is subjective norms. And basically, the norms are what is going to be true for the environment within which you are engaged. So, like the example used is, if you live out west, do you pass every morning, every afternoon, people walking along Bahamas Strip? Or if you live out east, do you pass around Bailey Park and people are walking? If the answer is yes, and you also are, you have a general positive attitude towards physical fitness, then that with the third one, which is the perceived control, whether or not you think you can do it, will help us understand it. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. We can go over TPB in class. Now, finally, when attitudes predict behavior, when attitudes are potent, then they are predictive of behavior. And how do attitudes get potent? Well, generally in two ways. One, when we choose the attitude through direct experience. And so think about the difference with how someone who converts to a non-traditional religion, how well their behavior aligns with what they say, and they are just in sync. as compared with the average, let's say, Bahamian who associates with being Christian, but may not necessarily, their behaviors, actions may not necessarily align. Because for the first one, when I'm choosing it, it's potent for me. This is real as compared to I was raised in this, and so I just kind of going along with the flow and doing, as what you think I should be doing or what somebody said I should be doing. The other instance when attitudes become potent is when we are made to be more self aware. Some researchers have found that just simply as looking at yourself in the mirror was enough to make individuals more aware of what they were doing and how their actions, whether it aligns with their attitudes or not. So, for example, smoking is bad, but yet I smoke. Is the smoking is bad from an attitude, that a belief that I have that I got from myself, or is that just what everybody else, I heard everybody else say, so I'm like, meh, okay, smoking is bad. And you may not think anything of the fact that you believe smoking is bad, but you're also smoking. Unless you would have, consciously thought about it or consciously had to think about it. And so maybe it is an option where you have to stand in front of the mirror with a, cigarette or whatever it is that you're smoking in your hand in order for you to really be like, oh, wow, is smoking really bad? And most likely what will happen is what we cover next. And that is when when behavior influences our attitudes. So the text suggests that we can think ourselves into a way of acting. And in this instance, behavior determines the attitude. So we don't only stand up for what we believe in, but we actually come to believe in what we stand up for. And so much so that mental after effects of our behavior appear in many social psychological examples of self-persuasion. And so going back to my example in the previous slide, if we were to bring it to your attention, do you really believe smoking is bad as you smoke a pack of cigarettes a day, or you have a joint a day, or you use some other type of smoking utensil, and then you're like, well, I don't. And it's not that I don't because, such and such and such, but now your attitude may adjust so that it can align with your belief. And so you're like, well, clearly smoking can't be that bad. I've been smoking for the past 3 years and nothing has happened. Or, I may be new to smoking, but I know my friend who smoked for 10 years and nothing has happened. Oh, I know everybody in my family who smokes and they've been smoking for 15 plus years and nothing has happened to them. And I'm using the example of smoking because I started with it, but and so this is not an intent to make anyone feel any kind of way, but this could be the same with, for example, those who identify as Christians, with something like premarital sex, with gossip, with racism, with the way that we treat other humans, with any number of things that relate to how our attitudes less likely predict how we behave. And so when we actually are confronted about our behavior, then we have to kind of back and we adjust our attitude. And so one of these instances where we see this really being true in terms of behavior leading out is role playing. And this is really a part of life. It is also, again, where, like I said, attitudes follow behavior. So a role, and I want you, when you think of a role, I want you to think theater, and it has to do really with the expectations of a person in a particular social position. So this is all about how are you supposed to act. And when we step into a new role, we may at first feel phony, but soon the role begins to fit. There is a thing called imposter syndrome that we tend to experience. We won't cover that here because that's not relevant here. But that is that sense of, oh, I don't belong. This don't really feel right. Oh, this isn't me. But you continue in the role and day by day by day, and eventually it becomes yours. It fits you now. You can identify with it. And the best example, and I think your text reference it, was, college student. I'm sure that the majority of you did not walk on UB's campus the first time you came on and actually felt like a college student. I'm sure you kind of were like, well, there's nothing changed between the time I was I graduated high school or whatever it was, that you would have done before, and then moving into college. And there had to be an adjustment that, okay, yeah, I am a college student. And sometimes, we gotta fake it till we make it. That's a part of the role play. And other times we just kind of like just let it just kind of push it to the back of our head. We do what we have to do. If I have to show up for class, I have to wake up early. Nobody's checking for me. I have to do my own homework. I have to do my own planning, blah, 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 until it becomes second nature and the thing that we see. Now, one of the landmark studies that has gotten a lot of flack, but is very popular, and we learned so much from it. Very similar to the studies of last week's classes, is Philip Zimbardo and the Stanford prison trials. And there's a lot that is covered with this, and I actually think we go over this again in another chapter. And we will talk about it. And you can just literally type in Zimbardo's prison study, and you will get a ton of YouTube videos that explain it. But basically, Zimbardo, social researcher, got people to sign up for a study. When they signed up, he randomly assigned them to various roles, whether it was prisoner, guard, those kinds of things, told them what they were to do in their role, locked them up in this kind of really real space where, there were cells and that kind of thing. So they really felt like they were in prison. And he found that in a matter of days, literally days, people had fully taken on their role as inmates or guards. The other thing was to make it real. They dressed up in the type of clothes. So those who were assigned to guards dressed up in prison officer uniforms, and the inmates put on like bland jumpsuits kind of thing, and they were given a number and were told not to use their name. And we learned so much from it. One of the things we see is just how easily it is for humans to fall into role playing. And the guards, the people who acted as guards, act in ways that were so uncharacteristic of them. But for the most part, they all felt like they were doing what was expected of them. So their behavior led the way. It wasn't their attitude. They weren't acting in ways that were necessarily aligned with how they thought about the situation. It was really what was expected of them in this role. And then post that, then the attitudes were adjusted because, well, they've already done this thing. So now I have to, I always say in social psychology, at the end of the day, it's helping us understand how we live with ourselves because of the social environment and things that we do. So yeah, they live with themselves. So then we see how that changes. And so that leads us into the next thing. And this is, so evil and moral acts. Similarly, when attitudes follow behaviors. And this one here is the worst for me in terms of really understanding human behavior, but it's helpful. It's so, so helpful in understanding how everyday people can become what we may refer to as monsters, where we are gasp, clutch my pearls, I can't believe that person did that. And well, you want to be careful that you're not too judgy, because you may find that in the right mix of a situation, under the right conditions, you too can act in ways that are heinous and are sick and are just awful. And so basically what we have found is that there is a dulling, there is a wearing down. And so if we produced one evil act, we do something that's bad, we are more likely to do something that is worse, because for the most part, our perspective is, well, I already break one law, or I already lie, or I already hear. And so this is how things spiral out of control. You literally started with something very, very simple, and then before you know it, it's bigger. This is how it happens, because it's gradually escalating commitment. And what we found is in wartime, this too is the same. When soldiers who were ordered to kill, their initial response may have been like, "Oh no, I can't do this. This makes me sick." They may have even gone out. Sorry for being so explicit, but they may have gone out and vomited after it did it. Had an actual visceral response to killing, but they do it once and they make it. The next time it comes, their thought is, "Well, I already did it once. Already, for the most part, quote unquote, then a bad person, I guess, or however we fix it in our head, and so it's like, okay, I could do it again. Now, here's where it gets interesting, is because whether or not we admit to ourselves that, quote unquote, we're a bad person, we've already done something that's bad, this changes because we're not going to live with ourselves as being cruel, that does not fit in our sense of self and us protecting our sense of self. And so what tends to happen is we flip the script. And so we find ways to devalue, dehumanize, demoralize the victims so that we can feel better about ourselves. And this similar effect works to shape moral acts. Our characters reflected in what we do when we think no one is looking, as people would say. A moral action, especially when it's chosen rather than coerced, affects our moral thinking. And there's unfortunately, some research that would have showed that, and I say unfortunately because sometimes these earlier research they have had some ethical implications, as we would have covered in previous chapters. And so in this example that I pulled from your text, we saw that killing begets killing. And students who believed that they had killed several bugs by dropping them into this quote-unquote killing machine, which really wasn't, then later killed more bugs during a self-paced killing period. So we should note that no bugs were actually killed in that study, but it did show us that them thinking that they had already done it pretty much just led them to be more inclined to do it. And now, as we close out, your chapter talks in the last section of this evil and moral acts. It really gives some understanding of how some of the social movements occurred, and really just understanding how some of the most atrocious kind of events in history that were initiated by another human. So we're not talking about tsunamis and earthquakes and hurricanes, but Nazi Germany and world wars and Rwandan camps and genocide. We understand a little better based on the work that's there. So I do want you to go to your text and cover that a little bit, and make sure you have a general understanding of that. And if you don't, then you can bring it to class to discuss. All right, and we are going to wrap up right there. That is it for the first part of chapter 4. When saying becomes believing. And I know it's hard to believe some of what comes out of some of our leaders' mouths, whether that's our leader, like the current prime minister or previous, or other world leaders, or leaders of churches or religious institutions. In fact, leaders across the board. The reality is, most people are going to. We've learned that humans say what they hope. They say what they think you want to hear, you as the receiving public. And so even I would have said on a number of occasions, I can't believe that person truly believes what they're saying. Like, they can't believe it. And one that jumps to mind is our neighbors to the north and their current president. And it's like, really? Like, does he really believe the stuff that's coming out of his mouth? And research suggests that we actually come to believe what we are saying. And this is true when there is no compelling external explanation for one's words. Then really saying becomes believing. The instances where this may not be true, where we may not come to believe what we say, is if we're bribed or coerced to do it. But if we say this because we need to, please the people who are around us, even though we may have doubts at the beginning, even though we may feel funny about it because that may be a lie, after we've said it, we have a tendency to adjust our beliefs to believe what we said. And part of this is because we cannot live with the idea that we are liars. Okay?